Singapore abstained from a special United Nations vote to suspend Russia from the UN Human Rights Council yesterday. It was among 58 countries that chose not to vote for or against the measure. The United States initiated the resolution following reports accusing Russian troops of human rights abuses in Ukraine. In total, 93 nations voted in favour of suspending Moscow. In explaining the vote, Singapore's Deputy Permanent Representative to the UN, that's Jo Fee Tang, made clear that Singapore condemns Russia's invasion of Ukraine. However, she noted that an independent commission was investigating the alleged human rights violations and that Singapore was awaiting its findings.
There must be accountability for any gross and systematic human rights violations that have taken place in the war in Ukraine. We urge all parties to cooperate with the Commission and allow full and unhindered access for the Commission to gather evidence and conduct its work.
Singapore's abstention, however, was not unexpected.
It's important to note the distinction that Singapore tends to make between international law pertaining to states and human rights issues pertaining to individuals. But at least up to right now, this is something that we've seen, and Singapore is acting quite consistently with its past record. We can debate where it should go, whether it should remain this way, whether it will remain this way, if further abuses are revealed. But we'll get to that stage when we see that evidence.
And here's a look at the position Singapore has taken so far. On the 24th of February, that's the day of Russia's invasion, Singapore's Foreign Affairs Ministry released a statement expressing grave concern over Moscow's, quote, special military operation in Ukraine, and that it condemns any unprovoked invasion. A few days later, on the 28th of February, Singapore took the rare step of imposing unilateral sanctions on Russia. Those include export controls on selected items and blocking certain Russian banks and financial transactions. This is only the second time that Singapore has censured another nation without the UN Security Council's approval. Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong said it's important for Singapore to respond to Russia's aggression, despite that conflict happening miles away. He said might is right will result in a dangerous world, especially for small countries like Singapore. On the 2nd of March, alongside more than 140 countries, Singapore supported a UN resolution denouncing Russia's invasion. The resolution called for Russia to stop the fighting and withdraw its military forces from Ukraine. As the conflict raged on, Singapore doubled down on its position. During a recent trip to the United States, PM Lee said Russia's invasion was, quote, an egregious, flagrant and major violation of international norms, and that the war will have major consequences for the global order.
You have to take a stand. You have to have the courage to do this, because if you don't do this and don't stand up, where will you stand if one day you need help and you say, please come, a fundamental principle is at stake, and we have to protect that principle.
Singapore was among a handful of ASEAN members to abstain from the special UN vote yesterday. As a group, the voting pattern by ASEAN members offers some insight into the motivations of individual countries. 6 of the 10-member ASEAN bloc abstained from the vote, and that includes Singapore, Indonesia and Thailand. Both Indonesia and Thailand said they abstained because they support an independent investigation into Russia's alleged war crimes in Ukraine. Meanwhile, Philippines and Myanmar were the only ASEAN members to vote for Russia's expulsion. Myanmar seems to have changed its stance. The country's military government had in the past expressed support for Russia's invasion of Ukraine, even praising President Vladimir Putin for his country's military strength. Laos and Vietnam voted against Russia's expulsion. Vietnam has so far refrained from condemning Russia's invasion of Ukraine. For more on ASEAN's response to the Ukraine crisis, Dawn is speaking with James Chin. He's Professor of Asian Studies at the University of Tasmania.
James, thank you for joining us. ASEAN members, they've taken rather different stances on expelling Russia from the UN Human Rights Council. Why did some nations, like Vietnam as an example, vote against the resolution?
Well, I think many ASEAN countries are thinking carefully what is the direction of the war. I think many things are unclear. Initially, I think ASEAN was quite united in condemning Russia. But I think now that we're in the 6th week of the war, I think most of the countries are thinking what will be the future outcome of the war? What will the post-war situation look like? So a lot of countries are doing their calculation based on the national interest. In some ways, we should not really be surprised that individual ASEAN countries have different approach to their relationship with Russia. I think the same thing happened when we saw the crisis with the military coup d'etat in Burma or Myanmar. Different countries, had different approaches, even towards a fellow member of ASEAN. So we shouldn't really be surprised.
So approaches may be dependent upon ties that certain countries have with Russia. And as an example, Myanmar has strong military links to the country, but it voted in favour of expelling Russia from the Human Rights Council. What can we read into that decision?
I think we have to be very careful when it comes to the issue of human rights, because I think it's quite clear that for the majority of ASEAN countries, human rights as defined by the West is very different from the way many ASEAN countries see human rights. So I wouldn't I wouldn't read too seriously into how the countries vote in terms of the human rights thing. I think much more important is the sort of vote that is taken at the UN General Assembly. I think that's a much more important vote. And I think for a lot of countries, they're also thinking that, it's quite difficult, because one of the problems is that Russia is a permanent member of the UN. So whatever resolutions or things that you pass at the UN, it probably won't get through because Russia is bound to use its veto. Plus, it looks like whatever Russia does, China will probably line up with Russia. So again, China is also a permanent member of the UN. So in some ways, the UN is really, not able to do much on this issue.
Mm. Well, James, for the longest time, ASEAN has taken this consensus-driven approach to working through and finding solutions. This conflict is taking place far away from the Southeast Asian region, but it has had implications, economic implications on the region so far. What about regional defence cooperation? Do you anticipate it'll have an impact on strategic alliances in that regard?
Not really. I think even if you look at ties of individual countries, I think the strongest one is probably Vietnam. The Vietnamese military has a long-standing ties with the Russian military. For example, we know that the Russian naval has been using a base in Vietnam for many decades. But having said that, I think the reality is that even trade with Russia is very limited. I think the sort of relationship we see with Russia from individual ASEAN countries, mostly in the second or third tier. Russia never really had a big presence in this region. I think if you look at this region as a whole, I think everyone is more worried about what's happening in China than rather what's happening in Ukraine. The only area where I think ASEAN is a bit worried is this idea that if you're a big country and you have the ability, you might want to invade or expand your borders. I think that's the fundamental rules that ASEAN is worried about. Other than that, I don't really see ASEAN stepping up to take an active interest in Ukraine.
But nonetheless, there have been inflationary pressures because of the Russia-Ukraine conflict on the prices of certain goods, as an example, on wheat, on sunflower oil, and so on. Do you think that these impacts are going to be enduring? And will different stances on this conflict from different ASEAN nations affect cooperation, perhaps, in the short term?
Not really. I think ASEAN will be ASEAN. There will be differences between individual members. And most people think that whatever impact the Ukraine war has on international trading system, this will be temporary. I think there's already people planning for the post-war situation. So I think if there's going to be any moves, everyone is sort of hoping to pressure Russia into some sort of settlement in Ukraine. I think everyone is thinking, this war can't last any longer. Everybody understands that there's some sort of stalemate in Ukraine. So everybody is sort of planning about what to do after the war is finished. Because it's quite obvious that once the war is over, right, the international community will be stepping with billions and billions of dollars to rebuild Ukraine and provide security guarantees. I think that's a much bigger issue rather than this sort of a short-term issue with dealing with the fallout from the war.
Be that as it may, how long this war continues on remains to be seen. James, thank you very much for that. That was Professor James Chin, Professor of Asian Studies at the University of Tasmania.